to another edition of the Pedalshift Project. The Pedalshift Project is a series of conversations, thoughts, and experiments around the bike touring lifestyle. From tips and tricks to ideas on how to ride your ride. Let's shrink the world by bike. Show notes and more are available at pedalshift.net/088, and you can email me at the show, pedalshift@pedalshift.net, or you can call the voicemail hotline, 202-930-1109, and you can check Pedalshift out also on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. I love it. The voicemail actually gets a shout out at the top of the show. Seriously, call it. It's there. Nobody ever calls it. You should call it. Oh, by the way, I'm Tim Mooney, your humble host. The 88th episode, I believe 88, there's all sorts of good hockey players who wore 88. I feel like Mario Lemieux, maybe? I should look that up before espousing that. 1988 was the year before I graduated from high school. There, dated myself. 88's a nice number. It's got that symmetry to it. It's pretty cool. So welcome to the 88th edition. If this is your first time, you've got 87 episodes to listen to. So go get cracking. If you've been with us for this whole time, thank you again for joining us. And on this episode, we've got all sorts of good stuff. We've got the journal. We're going to be cracking that open, talking about my heat index ride from last weekend, some tips on handling heat on your bike tour. Might have a thing or two to say about that. And then we've got some great stuff. We've got some follow-ups on a summer tour to follow, flying with your bike, emergency items. We've got connections. You guys have been busy, can I just say? And we'll, of course, wrap it all up by saying hello to Pedalshift Society members. But I'll say that right now. Hello, Pedalshift Society members. First up on the show is the journal, and this is the time when we talk about all things about our bike tours. And I'm going to start off with the very small, itty-bitty mini tour that I did last weekend. I talked about it on the last episode of the pod, but here we go. It was what I will now call the hashtag heat index ride. You may recall, for those of you who have been with the show for a while, or if you've listened to back episodes, turn the Wayback Machine all the way to episode, I believe, 010, when I did the Pacific Coast ride. Well, that ride I called, the longer version name of it was the Heat Stroke Avoidance Alternative Tour 2014 or something like that. And it's going with the long held theme of the show that I dislike the heat. I don't care for it. I don't like riding in it, but I do. I mean, I live in Washington, D.C. If you don't bike in the heat and humidity, you do not bicycle at all. So I've gotten used to it, and I've kind of grown to terms with it. So last week we were in the midst of a gigantic heat dome, as they call it. And the heat dome was giving us heat indexes, which is a scientific combination, I guess, of temperature, the absolute temperature, and humidity. And so they combine those two things in some kind of way. I don't know how, and they come up with what's called a feels-like temperature. Well, the feels-like temperature, or the heat index, was 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Celsius, folks, I will invite you to do the math. It is hot. It's probably in the 40s or flirting with 40 or something like that. It's hot. It was very hot. It was very uncomfortable. But Friday night of last week was the only opportunity I had for kind of a nice camping overnight. And it was hot. It was uncomfortable, but I still wanted to go anyways. And I did all sorts of different things to try to make my life a little bit more comfortable. And I'll talk a little bit more about that kind of in the next half segment down the road here. But I do want to talk a little bit about the ride. The ride itself was really fun. Again, went out on the old faithful, the Chesapeake and Ohio towpath. It's the C&O. It is in my backyard. I might as well take advantage of it. I always have lots of different options with the C&O. But for this ride, I thought, you know what? I don't want to get complicated. I don't want to deal with Amtrak. I don't want to deal with anything. All I'm going to do is get on my bike, leave home, and ride, and just keep riding. And there are multiple camping opportunities that are for free, that are within, anywhere from an hour and a half to 2 hours ride. And so I set my sights on the second camping opportunity outside of DC. There are really three. The first one is about, 9.5 miles away, or at least at mile marker 9.5. It's about 2 miles or so, or a mile and a half or so for me to get to the trailhead. So you do the math and kind of add those things on. So it's not that much. But the first one is a group campground that's typically grouped with Boy Scout troops and things like that. And you need a permit to stay there. Now, I've seen all sorts of people stay there all the time, and it doesn't seem to be a heavily enforced type of a thing. But on a nice summer Friday weekend, I figured that it would definitely be filled anyways. And plus, I wanted to go further than 9.5 miles out. So in fact, I always do. I've never stayed there once. I've considered it, but I never have. The next one out is about mile marker 16, and this is a campsite that I've talked about before. It has a parking lot immediately across the towpath from it, so you tend to get a lot of, I'm going to say it, real high schoolers of Potomac, if that's like a reality show. And they love to bring their beers, and they love to do their drinking and their drinking games, which is perfectly fine. Except it's not, I guess. I don't know. No judgments here. But like, I don't want to camp near that. I've done it. It's not always the best. So I decided that I would continue to go, to the next one. The next campsite is away from everything. There's no parking lots. There's nothing. It's the first one that you can go to where you're really sort of in a space where you have to hike or bike to get to it. And that's around mile marker 26. It's Horsepen Branch. It's a nice campsite. It's got nice access to the river. That was my target. So that was what I really wanted to do, and I felt strong as heck. We were doing a photo shoot here in my home/recording studio, really more just kind of a little one-bedroom apartment here in DC. The photo shoot was not for me. I know that's shocking, but it was for my girlfriend's clothing line. She was, so we had the model here, the photographer. We've done this before. I usually hang around and kind of help out a little bit. But once that was all done, I packed up all my stuff. I had it all kind of ready to go, and I just rode off into the 100-degree plus heat, and it felt fine. It was really not bad. The one thing that I had going for me was that the sun was behind a bunch of clouds. It was a really muggy, oppressive day in that sense. But behind those clouds, man, it was much better. Once I got out of the sort of open area and into the green tunnels of the C&O, basically there's just a lot of tree cover. Things were really pretty good at that point, and it was easy riding. Since I've been losing the weight, I've noticed that riding, especially on flats, is even easier than normal, and that feels really good. I was carrying a moderate load. I wasn't going with, some kind of ultra light thing, even though it was an overnight, mainly because I knew it was going to be really hot. So I decided, and I'll talk about this more in a few minutes, about bring stuff to keep you cool while you go. Now, of course, there's all sorts of different ways that you can do it, but I brought a collapsible cooler along with me full of all sorts of good stuff. I never did that before. But it was so nice to have. I had salad. I had a bagged salad at the end of the day, and I'm not going to lie to you, I flouted the Park Service rules. I had a couple of cold beverages that I don't believe that they allow. Don't tell anybody. Is anybody listening? Is this thing on? So I got there, and I enjoyed using that collapsible cooler. I will absolutely do that again, as I mentioned. I definitely feel like that carrying the extra weight was worth it, because at the end of a day and you're really overheated, I'm dumping water on top of my head and stuff like that. I had access to plenty of water, so I was finding good ways to cool myself down. It just felt really good when you're able to do stuff like that, when you're not worried about, I better hold on to that water because you never know how it's going to go. So it worked out pretty well for me. I was very happy about that. So I get to camp, and I was really excited because I thought, you know what? It's a hot day. There's very few people on this trail. You know what? I bet you I'm going to have this campsite to myself. No, absolutely not. No, wrong. I passed by the kegger campsite, as I like to call it, at mile marker 16 and a half-ish. And nobody was there. And I thought, oh, man, it's going to be so dead. It's great. It's too hot. People, look at me being so cool to overcome the heat, and I'll have a great camping experience. I get there, and there were two other people with bikes that were already there, and they had a fire going, and it looks like they'd been there for at least a day. So I was like, okay, well, that's cool. And then I noticed as I kept rolling, there was another person. There was a third person there. I was like, this is like, Huckleberry Hill over in Harper's Ferry, where you normally see a lot more people. And then, okay, well, that's fine. There's still plenty of room. So I went to the far end of the camp, had a spot, got my bike all kind of propped up. And then I immediately dove into my cooler, because I was like, that stuff is not going to get any colder. So I started, getting my food together, popping open some cold beverages, and then all of a sudden, the skies opened. There was this small, minuscule chance of a thunderstorm, highly scattered, 20% or less chance. Well, the odds were not with me, and I just got hammered. So the first thing I did when I felt the first couple of drops, realizing what was going to happen, was I had Bluetooth headphones on, and I had my phone in my pocket. I knew that the phone was going to get drenched if I didn't get it covered really soon. And I thought, you know what? Most of my stuff I can keep dry, but why don't I just kind of focus on that? So what I did was I opened up one of my panniers, had the tent rainfly at the top there, pulled that out and just draped it over the bike, over everything, made sure I got the phone underneath it and everything like that. I had already pulled out the hammock and hung the hammock beforehand. As I've talked about on the show, I'm really liking carrying this thing. It's about the size of a softball, give or take, not too big. Got it up on the trees, and it was already going to get soaked no matter what. So I thought, I'm just going to stand out in the rain. And I did. And it cooled me down. The rain was kind of that nice summer warm rain, but still cooling. I mean, obviously it's cooler than your body temperature. And even though I started to get soaked, there's a certain point when you're wetter than you can possibly get. There's no, you cannot get possibly wetter than what you are in that moment. And that's where I was. And so I just sort of enjoyed it. I sat down in the rapidly getting wetter hammock, and I leaned back and I ate my bagged salad. And I kept closing the top of it so more water wouldn't get into it. But I was having a great old time. Everybody else was retreating into their tents, running away from the rain and everything. And I was like, this is fine, because I knew everything else was going to stay dry. I had my camp towel underneath there as well. So I knew, hey, as wet as I'm going to get, I can dry off, and I'll be able to dry off and get inside a dry tent. So it all worked out really well. I felt really good. And the rain started to end, and I was really relaxed. I was listening to podcasts. My phone was dry underneath the tarp, the rainfly, and it ended up working out really well. So as the rain was ending, I was getting ready to think about, all right, what am I going to do? Where am I going to sit down? Am I going to stay in the hammock? How am I going to handle things? And then about a dozen people came rolling up in various states of undress because it was freaking hot, and I don't blame them. And it was a group of, I think it was close to 10, 12 people, who were coming in for the night. And all of a sudden this campsite that was, I wouldn't say it was at full capacity, because they all fit, but it was, as crowded as one normally gets, especially for not what I would call a destination campsite. Well, they all found their corners and stuff, and they were a group. And first thing I heard, one of the women was like, "I brought wine," and I was like, Oh, I know how this evening's going to go. So I realized that I was not going to probably have a quiet night. I wasn't going to have my communing with nature kind of a thing. Understandable. I'm excited. I'm cool with people enjoying their bike touring. That's great. I guess my sort of takeaway from all of this is, although I feel like that nobody was out of bounds in that group, I think I'd like to throw this out, especially if you do ride in groups and you're bringing your adult beverages with you and whatnot. Kind of be mindful of the folks around you. I'm not saying that I had any problems with any of this, but the guy that was a tent over from me clearly wanted to be left alone. The folks that were at the far end of the camp, they weren't exactly, hangout and party types, it didn't seem. I mean, they kind of kept to themselves. But, this group really sort of not only just physically took over, but sort of occupied the space in a way that changed the nature of the campsite. So no longer did any of us have this sort of cool, oh, awesome, the river's here off the bank here, and we're all chill and relaxing and enjoying nature. We were in the middle of that group's thing and that group's dynamic. And so if you're in a group, just throwing it out there, be cool with everyone. I am the last person to say, hey, you should kind of chill out and don't be too loud and all that other stuff. Because, hey, I'm a loud talker. When I'm talking in groups and stuff, I recognize I sort of probably go outside the boundaries of where our group is. But I'm learning more and more that everyone who does bike touring is out there for a different thing. And sort of when your group dominates and takes over, it's just something to think about that, try to be mindful that you're sharing the space. And I think this is true of using a trail like the C&O. There's people who are walking. There are people who are fishing. There are people who are doing all sorts of different things. And so we're all trying to share. So make sure that you are sharing in a way that is beneficial to everybody else out there. Just a little kind of public service message right there. Didn't think anybody acted out of bounds, but I felt like that they were sort of towing the line on that. But everybody seemed like they were having a good time. They stayed up very late, much later than I probably would have stayed up, but I had the magical earplugs and the magical podcast just made my night just awesome. And although I was friendly and said hello, just wasn't interested in having that vibe. This was meant to be a solo weekend for me. And it was. And it ended up being fine. But, let's be cool with each other when we share campsites. That's all I'm saying. So heat index ride, woke up the next morning. It didn't get out of the 80s overnight. I had a little fan with me and I just turned that sucker on for the whole night. I had sort of restless sleep even after the noise abated. But when all was said and done, the fan really makes a big difference, really cooled me down, and I slept pretty well. In fact, I slept well enough that I didn't wake up until well after the sun rose. And at that point, I was sort of like, it's not going to get any cooler out there. We had a similar kind of day the following day on Saturday, and my intention was to turn around and ride home. So I just sort of packed up and got myself together and got out, and it was still relatively cool when I left. But by the time I got back, which was a couple, maybe 2.5 hours later, I was back by late morning, but it was starting to really climb up there again. It was definitely back into the 90s, at least Fahrenheit, and the humidity was still pretty high. So, in terms of how I dealt with the heat, it was hotter on the way out. But because of the nature of the ride on the way back, and maybe I didn't get as much sleep, I certainly didn't have the amount of food in me that I did going out. The ride back was a little bit tougher, which I thought was really interesting when all was said and done, because riding conditions were arguably a little bit easier. So all of these things you sort of learn about when you do these sub 24 hour overnights, those S24Os as they're called. But when all is said and done, man, I really love doing stuff like that. It's really invigorating for me. Not only is it good from a physical workout perspective, but it's just good for me mentally to be able to get away like that. And, I was only gone for a night. I got back. The dogs were all excited when I got back. And, Kimberly held down the fort just fine because she she doesn't need me around. That's for sure. So it was just nice to have that. And I'm looking forward to doing more of those, even when it's stupid hot again this summer. And it's going to be, because that's how Washington, D.C. is. So that was how the heat index ride went. I'm enjoying a nice, what is this? The Sea Quench Ale Session Sour from Dogfish Head, which is probably, I would argue, in this region, while there is a great craft brewing scene that's developing here in the DC area immediately here, I would say in the Mid-Atlantic region, Dogfish Head is probably one of the better known and certainly more expanding breweries, but it's still sort of maintaining that small craft brewer vibe. This is a seasonal sour, and it is really good. If you have access to this, I'm obviously no beer mongers promos here or anything like that. For those of you who listen to the Sprocket, they're too far away from me. But if you are interested, I understand they're on Southeast Division and 12th or something. Anyways, this is a good one. Check that one out. Handling the heat. So, I spent just the last 20 minutes or so, or close to that, talking about the ride. Here are some tips, I would say, for handling heat on your bike tour. Like I said, I've grown accustomed to this. I've learned how to bike tour in the summer environment of the Mid-Atlantic region, specifically DC. So I've thought about this. I hate the heat. I'm on record on that. So when you dislike the heat, you find ways to try to ameliorate it, try to fix it, try to make it so that it's easier to deal with. So here are my tips for handling heat on a bicycle tour. The first thing I'd say is time your riding appropriately. If it's really going to be a very hot ride, there is nothing wrong with changing your schedule and accommodating the heat instead of when you would prefer to ride. Let me give you an example. Now, on this ride, It was the return trip that I changed. I left a little bit earlier, but frankly, I tend to leave right when I get up anyway, so I didn't really change what I did. But I'll give you another example, and this will go back to the Pacific Coast route as well. When you're doing the Pacific Coast route, it's one of the reasons I love it is because it hugs the coastline. If you're doing it during the summer especially, it can be 20 to 30 degrees cooler along that route than it is inland, and sometimes kind of quite a bit more. There's one section in California which is just south of where the redwoods really hit, the Avenue of the Giants. In fact, generally speaking, most people stay at Burlington Campground, and I've talked about this place before. It's probably one of my favorite campsites I've ever stayed at from a bike touring perspective. Once you leave there and go further south, that whole next day you shoot inland, and you go through a town called Garberville. You're in an area where the temperatures are going to be 20 to 30 degrees higher. You've been used to nights in the 50s, days that maybe are going to get into the upper 60s. Now you're getting into 90 degrees plus Fahrenheit and direct exposure to the sun, the fog, the marine layer, all of that's gone. So it's a real crash course if you're not expecting it or if you're not used to it. So what I've done in the past and what I would recommend, and this gets back to timing your riding, is I leave stupid early. In fact, I wake up before the sun rises. I've never done any night riding in that area because the Avenue of the Giants is unshouldered, and there's still quite a bit of it left. There's usually about, I think, 10 to maybe 12 more miles left to continue south on that route. And so I don't trust drivers in the early morning to be able to pick me out even with their headlights. Not as much. I wear lights, obviously. I've got the reflective stuff. I've got the crazy orange panniers. You know how it is. But I find that I still prefer to do daylight riding. So what I do is I will get up in the 4 o'clock hour and get my tent all packed up and get everything put away. And then, in fact, the night before, I pack up everything that I can that I'm not directly using. But once I get all packed up and I get everything put away, I basically just wait until we get at least a little bit of realistic twilight. And that's just enough so that you can see. You don't necessarily need a light to see. And then I start rolling. And what that allows me, and we're talking maybe about 5 or 5:15 in the morning, during if it's summer, of course, that allows you maybe about 4 or sometimes 4.5, 5 hours before temperatures really start to climb in the area that I'm going to. And so frequently I'll be through Garberville. I'll be able to stop and go to a grocery store there because it's the last real town of note on that route. And I'll be able to be on my way and have something cold for the second half of it. And I can be done with my riding by very early in the afternoon. In fact, on one particular occasion, I was done and got to the campsite that I had intended to go to. And I was like, I still got energy left in me, and I had some other compelling reasons to continue on and get up because there was no cell phone signal there. So this is a really long way of saying time your rides early, because by going early, you can really beat the heat, get your miles in, and then find some shade and just chill out. For those of you that would need to do more miles on top of that, stay there. Stay from about 11 a.m. or noon and stay there until 4, 5, 6 o'clock. Then you've still got 2, 3 more hours of sunlight if you're in the summer months to keep going. Of course, your mileage may vary depending on where you're at and what time it is, or what time of year it is, and geographically where you're at. So, think about that. Time your riding. That's, I think, the number one tip that I would give. Number 1A, really, most people would put this first: hydration. You literally cannot drink enough water typically. Now, I'm going to put a caveat on there because there is such a thing as hyperhydration. You can actually drink so much water that it would poison you. If you're not also balancing it out with electrolytes, you actually can create more harm than good. So watch your hydration. You probably can't drink too much water when you're in a scenario when you're riding in real heat. But I would also recommend that you pair that hydration with electrolytes as well. I've talked about electrolyte pills. I'll put a link in the show notes, pedalshift.net/088 to the types of electrolyte pills. I have a naturopathic doctor that I've been to before, and she recommended those, and they really changed how I rode. I would cramp up at the end of every ride on one of these hot rides. Like, I don't know if any of you get this, but those kinds of cramps in your calf where it just balls up and you have to kind of stretch your foot out by walking on it to be able to get that calf to release. Totally the worst. These things really, really help. And when I sometimes we'll still get them at the end of the night. I'll know, okay, I can pop one of those, and that's going to flood my system with electrolytes and be in a good balance. They're easily absorbable. And frankly, they're just a lot better than the sports drinks that are out there, which are full of sugar and junk that you probably don't necessarily want to have. Your mileage may vary. As I've talked about, I'm not huge on sugar these days. So hydration is really, really important paired with electrolytes. Next thing on the list is sun protection. And, it's a huge thing to find shade for yourself. That means wearing a hat, even a goofy wide brimmed hat. I've started pulling the one that I have out, and I'll tell you, it does make a difference. If you've got any exposed skin, got to go with sunscreen. There's just too much data out there that shows that exposure to sun has all sorts of negative impacts. I know you paleo types and all that. You love your sun. You could still get your sun, but I'm telling you, if you're going to be out on the road for a really long time, you got to protect the skin. Sunscreen's one thing, but I tend to like to not put as many chemicals on me as possible. Because they're just gross. Let's face it. But I use these things called arm shades. They're sort of like a stretchy, lycra-y kind of a thing, but what's great about them is they have real SPF protection because it blocks the sun rays completely. But they also have this nice property of when they're wet, they'll give you that evaporative cooling. So as you sweat underneath it or put water on top of it if it's really dry, you're going to get a really nice cooling effect from that prevailing wind as you cycle. So really love those. They actually make those things in neck protectors, full head protectors, leggings, the whole 9 yards. I think that I've seen pictures of people out on boats, especially fishermen, will wear a lot of these things and they'll look like some crazy, burn victim kind of thing. Not to make fun of burn victims, but you know what I'm talking about visually, right? They work really well, and I've considered doing that for rides where I would have more sun exposure than just, protecting my arms. But I think that they're really fantastic. They are so cheap. You can save money in the long run on a sunscreen and stuff like that. And I think they're more effective. I really recommend those. And you can just peel them off and walk inside and not look like some kind of strange creature from another planet when you're wearing them. So that would be your sun protection. Next up, frequent breaks. Find ways to get into some cool areas as much as possible. That may not be very easy, but I would say at least seek out shade to begin with, because that makes a gigantic difference and you'll feel it immediately, especially if you're in desert conditions. Air conditioning, you know what? Some people eschew air conditioning as much as possible. They don't like it. But frankly, when it's a difference between getting your body temperature cooled down and your core cooled down and you have that opportunity, I'd really recommend that you go for some AC when you can. Stop at those restaurants, stop at those mini marts and cool down in those places. And that goes hand in hand with the final thing here, finding ways to cool your core, cool that inside. Use cool drinks. Carry a cooler if it's at all possible. That's what I did on this last trip, and I'll tell you what a difference it made. To be able to have literally icy water at the end of my ride was just fantastic. Snacks that are cold, just keeping things that are below the ambient temperature out there can really make a difference, and they really perk you up too. I find, at least, that when you have that, it just gives you that extra little burst of energy that goes beyond just what you're eating or drinking. So finding those ways to cool the core with things that are cold that you can drink or eat is my last tip. So nothing really groundbreaking here, but just stuff to talk about, stuff to consider. It's that time of year. If you're not cycling up above the Arctic Circle, as some of you I know are doing, and I'll be talking about at least one of them here, it's just a good set of tips to have to be able to enjoy your rides a little bit more, because, if it's hot where you're at, if you don't cycle in the heat, you don't cycle. So we want you to do that. So hopefully those tips will be helpful for you. Next up on the show, we've got follow-ups to all sorts of different fun topics. Number one, I talked about summer tours to follow, and I've got one for you, and it just happens to turn out it's a buddy of mine from here in the DC area. You can follow him over at Snoring Yogi over on Instagram, and I'm hoping to get him on the show later on in the summer or the fall upon his return. He's touring Scandinavia right now on a fat, tired Surly. And I'll do all the introductions and everything later for him. But for now, Snoring Yogi on Instagram, link in the show notes, pedalshift.net/088. It looks like a really fun ride. You'll recall that Mysterious James was up in Scandinavia earlier this summer. He's actually back in San Francisco now. What's up, MJ? And, it's just looks like a really great place to explore, to camp. There's all sorts of great rules and customs that are up there about wild camping. Essentially, you can go almost any place that there's open land, which is really fantastic, and people are friendly. If you're a primary or practically exclusively English speaker, such as myself, lots of people speak English. I always try to at least fumble my way through whatever language is spoken in the area that I'm in. But it's always nice to know that my complete monolingual capabilities are at least catered to a little bit in places like that. It makes it feel a little bit better. So Snoring Yogi, go check out him on Instagram. He's got some really great stuff. By the way, in addition to having some great photos and a really cool bike, this is his first really big tour. I think he did a couple of shakeout and overnights before all of this. So if you're new to this, check out Snoring Yogi and know that you don't have to be some pro level tourer to do big things, and you can tackle this stuff and you'll see he's having a great old time. So you don't have to have tons of experience before you tackle a big trip like that. So check it out, and I hope you enjoy it, and hopefully we'll get him on the show later on this year. Next up in follow-ups, a little bit on flying with your bicycle. So as you recall, Alaska Airlines appears now to be the best US-based carrier for flying with your bike. The fee is now $25 each way, which is absolutely amazing. We covered that last week on the last episode. There was an open question about whether or not Virgin America, another US-based carrier, whether its policy was going to be similar or whatever, because they're involved in a merger right now. And I know I'm going to be flying them in September out to the West Coast. What's the answer here? Drum roll. I have no drum rolls. I have no effects. Virgin America's fee for the moment remains the same, but it was actually pretty good before. They were amongst the better ones, $50 per each direction to fly your bike. So that's still among the best in the States. But presumably, and I did not call to find this out, but presumably after the merger, they'll, during that transition time, when there still are Virgin America jets out there, they'll almost assuredly be following that Alaska Airlines $25 each direction fee. So keep an eye out for that. Those are two really good airlines in the U.S. if you're looking for bookings regarding your bike. Now, do they go where you want to go? Compare ticket prices, all that other kind of stuff. But both of them have pretty good deals for flying with your bike. So go check them out. Next up on follow-up, emergency items. This is from friend of the show and Pedalshift Society member Ethan Georgi. You hear his name every single week at the end of the show. You're listening to the end of the show, right? You are? You are. Ethan Georgi writes, EMS, and I imagine REI, etc., have pre-packaged first aid kits with everything you need. This way you don't have to figure out what to put in it and assemble all the stuff yourself, done for you. They come in various sizes depending on the number of people in your party. I've been carrying mine for years. Regarding ice cards, again, not cards made of ice, RoadID.com is his recommendations. Ethan writes, they have a ton of great options. Most importantly, they're easy to find by first responders. And he raises something here that I think is actually a good point. Expecting anyone to dig through your panniers while you're bleeding out sounds like an unnecessary hassle. I think that's right. Let's make this as easy as possible. So getting something that's attached to your body is a good idea. On your phone, I think would be another good thing as well. Another thing that I wanted to add as a follow-up to all of that, and added to the varsity level comms devices that you may want to consider when we talked about the cell phone being a basic one that you'd want to carry. And of course, for many of you, you're carrying that anyways. I was talking more about the folks who tend not to have a lot of technology with them. I think carrying some kind of communication device with you is sort of a basic emergency item you should carry. If you are going to be in places where you know cell service is not going to be, or where maybe you're traveling abroad, or you're otherwise going to be in a way where your cell phone will not work, I would recommend going up to some of these varsity level things potentially. I talked about the Spot on the show. I got a link in the show notes to one of their products, but also the Garmin InReach. I ran into that recently. Both of these devices allow you to do some communication, non-emergency communications to friends and family back home. Now, the Spot allows you this kind of like 10, it feels like maybe 15 characters, barely really anything, in terms of the message that you can put out when you ping your location. The Garmin InReach has, as part of its package, you can actually send real actual text messages to people through the device, and it works through the satellite system. I think that that's a really good idea for sort of things that are important communications that you want to have that don't rise to the level of emergency. Of course, it's great for the emergency situations as well. It's got the similar type of capabilities as the Spot for summoning folks when you're in a pinch. So 2 varsity level things, the Spot, the Garmin InReach. Go check those out. I got links in the show notes if you're interested in stuff like that. Next up on the show, connections. People. You've been busy. You've been very, very busy. It's been 1 week since I did the show. I received 4 additional 5-star reviews. You are all amazing, just collectively, and you're collectively amazing. But let's talk about these 4. As I've mentioned on the show in the past, if you are interested in having your iTunes handle revealed to a small percentage of the world, 5-star review. I'll read them on the show. Also, saying nice things about Syracuse University, but nobody did that this week, but it's still possible for you if you would like. From One Revelations, instrumental in helping newbies start touring. 5 stars. I have been appreciating this podcast for the author's sensible outlook and helpful information for those interested in touring. Love it. Thank you. Thank you, One Revelations, for your 5-star review. I appreciate that you think I'm sensible. That is a minority opinion, I would say. Great Pod by Ice Bike 17. I am a newer listener. Welcome. However, I am currently on tour in Iceland and catching up on the older episodes in the morning while getting ready for the day. Lots of great ideas and conversations. I would call, but no cell coverage. That is okay, IceBike17. I am excited to hear about your tour when you get back. So maybe you can call that lately used Pedalshift hotline and tell us all about your tour. That's really cool. Thank you for your 5-star review. Let's see. Love Pedalshift by the Matt Perry. When I first read it, I thought it was them at Perry or them ATT Perry, but then I realized I should actually read it differently. It's the Matt Perry. He writes, I'm a semi-experienced 2-wheel tourist currently trying to integrate riding more into my life and travel. I wish I'd known about this podcast when I was just starting out touring. It certainly would have saved me a bunch of headaches and accelerated my learning. Nowadays, I listen to Tim's sensible, there's that word again, sensible advice, rational opinions about stuff, and general good vibes. Particularly relevant for me lately has been the advice about flying with or transporting my bike. Well, that's helpful because we talked about that on the show too, Matt. More than anything, though, I say this as someone who tours mostly solo. This podcast has been a bit of a front door to the large community of people who love to set out on 2-wheeled adventures as much as I do. I know you pop up in Portland, and this is now he's writing to me at this point. I know you pop up in Portland once in a while, Tim, but should you ever end up up a bit north in Seattle, national hub of Alaska Airlines, so bring the bike for cheap. Geez, that's just dry. References to past shows. Please give me a shout out and we'll go for a ride up here in the Northwest. Final piece of shameless promotion, if Apple will even let me post this. Spoiler alert, they did. I write about some of my biking adventures. Find that stuff, if you'd like, at 4 ranges or 4. I want to say it's 4 inches just because you know where I come from. 4ranges.wordpress.com. Keep up the good work, Tim, and many thanks. Thank you, Matt. I really appreciate it. And I checked out your blog really quickly. I'm looking forward to reading more about it, but it looks really cool. So yeah, go check that out. I'll have a link in the show notes, everybody. It's 4ranges.wordpress.com or 4ranges. What would be the best way to describe it? I would say a lot about finding time to bike when you can, especially in cool places. He travels for work and he talks about biking in all these different places. He biked in France, which I've done as well, and it's very cool. So go check out Matt's stuff. And apparently you can get away with direct communication through 5-star reviews on Facebook. Or excuse me, that's not Facebook, that's iTunes. Apple, Facebook. What's the difference? Tech companies, right? California. Last but not least, yet another 5-star review from Harris Tweeter, which I have to say may be one of my favorite iTunes handles so far. I'm not talking about you, SU Hoops 44. You're still my favorite, but this may be my second favorite handle just because it's very clever. And short but sweet, 5 stars, one of my favorite podcasts. Thank you, Harris Tweeter. Thank you for listening. Thank you all for being a part of the show. And again, the reason why I make a big deal about this is that there is some weird dark magic in Cupertino where you get 5-star reviews. That means more people end up seeing it, more bikey people see it. And I don't know why it works that way. It just is. Ask Apple. It's how it works. So go check out Matt's blog. Thank you all for your 5-star reviews. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for listening. And as always, we like to close out the show with a big thank you to all of the supporters of the show through the Pedalshift Society. If you like what you hear, you can help maintain Pedalshift as an independent, listener-supported voice while expanding the offerings. Talking $5 a month, $2 a month, even $1 a month helps with the cost of hosting the podcast, the website. You can do it for a little while, stop anytime, super easy. One-shot support is welcome. If you're not into the whole small monthly thing, you can check it all out and join at pedalshift.net/society. On to the society. Ethan Georgi, Kimberly Wilson, Caleb Jenkinson, Cameron Lane, Andrew McGregor, Michael Hart, Josiah Matthews, Keith Nagel, Brock Dittis, Thomas Skadow, Seth Krieger, Marco Lowe, Terrence Manson, Noah Schroer, Harry Telgadas, John Sikorsky, Richard Killian, Chris Barron, Scott Taylor, Brian Wren, Mark Van Ram, Brad Hipwell, Paul Mulvey, Stuart Buchan, Todd Stutz, Mr. T, Roxy Arning, Nathan Poulton, Harry Hugel, Ferguson Meek, Stephen Dickerson, Vince Lagreco, Ruth Divorcey, Michelle Miller, Matthew Lewis, Michael Baker, Billy Crafton, Paul Culbertson, and new this episode, Scott Culbertson and Matt Perry, and all anonymous and past contributors. Thank you for making the show happen. Thank you for joining. You can find Pedalshift at pedalshift.net. Lots of great content. You can hear the Pedalshift Project through iTunes or your favorite podcast aggregator. Opening music courtesy of Jason Kent off his debut album. The track is called America. Check out his band Sunfield's latest release, Habitat, wherever cool music is available.